Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. It's me, Urza Master. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. And we are back with another episode of Star Trek The Original Series. And another interesting one. I don't want to steal any thunder from Fert Derby here. But suffice to say that this episode had me grabbed. Fert Derby, let's hear a little bit of background on immunity syndrome.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all you Trekkies out there. We are on January 19th, 1968, a pivotal year in American history, world history, and Star Trek history, the immunity syndrome. And I want to take a moment here at the top of the show, and I want to give a shout out to longtime director, returning champion Joseph Pevney. This is the final episode of the original series that he helmed, and I'm just going to take you briefly back all the way into season 1 so that we can celebrate all of the unique stylings Mr. Pevney has done. He was tied with Mark Daniels for the most episodes directed during the show's original run. And which ones did we talk about? Oh, we talked about them all. He made his debut with The Gorn and Arena. Then he did The Return of the Archons, A Taste of Armageddon, The Devil in the Dark, The City on the Edge of Forever, Amok Time, The Apple, Cat's Paw, Journey to Babel, Friday's Child, The Deadly Years, Wolf in the Fold, The Trouble with Tribbles, and he climaxes with the immunity syndrome. So we've all talked about those on the Warp Core in various archives. You can scroll through and find your favorite Joseph Pevney episodes. We certainly have ours. And we also have a couple that turned out to be not so great. I'm looking at you, Apple and Cat's Paw. But nevertheless, he was a trooper. And I never got the sense that he phoned it in. And they kept going to the well with Joe because he understood the show and he understood the characters. And even in the bad episodes, you still had that instant chemistry, as Lord Uther puts it, between the big three of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And they could spin silk out of a sow's ear when they had to. In this case, thank you, Joseph, for all you gave us here on the 5-year mission. We have a new writer for Immunity Syndrome, Robert Sabaroff. He actually wrote a Next Generation episode, Home Soil. Go ahead and Google that one, Trek fans, if you're not familiar with it. I'm sure we'll be covering it here on the Warp Core. We'll probably get to Next Generation around 2027 with our current scheduling, so stay tuned. He also did the story for the Next Generation episode, Conspiracy. So he's got some Trek in his blood. He also worked on several Westerns, Death Valley Days, The Virginian, Bonanza, and then inexplicably The Equalizer. No, not the Queen Latifah or Denzel Washington versions. This was Edward McCall on CBS in the mid-'80s. So that's where he is coming from. And in this one, we have, again, if you want to break Trek down into classic tropes, godlike beings who confront the crew, or mysterious illnesses that lay half the crew down in sick bay and so forth. In this case, we kind of get a little bit of everything. The godlike beings in this case is actually a space amoeba, but we still have the crew felled by a mysterious resistance. And what I think, and I'm not sure Gene Roddenberry and Gene L. Kuhn and John Meredith Lucas and D.C. Fontana were espousing here, but it looks like a pretty reliable and serious drug habit that Dr. McCoy puts on the crew and keeps shooting them up with adrenaline and keeps upping the dosages to keep them all on their feet. And I'm sure there's a lot we can talk about addiction and so forth. And I don't know if they wanted to open that box paradoxically here, but it certainly jumped out at me as we were watching it, that the solution to McCoy has is give them more drugs. So we had that. We had some good dialogue. Shut up, Spock, we're rescuing you. Insufficient data is not sufficient. Kindly tell me what happened to the stars, and so on. And we even got a halftime speech from Kirk to keep the crew on their toes as they encountered this mysterious otherworldly being, much like they have encountered giant space caterpillar whales and other things flying through the gamma quadrants and the alpha quadrants. In this case, I think I want to start the discussion with a choice that Kirk has to make as the captain, as the man who will soon grace a statue in front of Starfleet Academy, several, we hope, having to choose which of his friends, closest allies, crew members, wingmen, the big three, which one he will send ostensibly to their death in order to rescue the lives of everyone else on the crew. Will it be the good doctor, or will it be a science officer? And I think the episode works best when concentrating on this thorny moral dilemma faced by Kirk. Ultimately, it is Spock who takes the controls of the shuttle. And I'm just wondering, gentlemen, as they kind of set up the debate, the discussion, the argument, the decision, did it end up being the right choice? If you had been Kirk, would you have sent the Vulcan or the good Southern doctor? I mean, as it turns out, the episode All's Well That Ends Well. But I'm just curious, wrestling with that, and you have to think back in context. You know, we're in 1968 in late January. We're like, wait a minute, are we going to lose a cast member here? Is it possible? Like, is this a mission with a point of no return? So I throw it out to my fellow Trekkies. What did you think of the immunity syndrome? But more importantly, how did you rate Kirk's choice and agonizing dilemma?
I think this is probably one of the more brilliantly written episodes of Star Trek, despite the somewhat goofy premise of a giant space amoeba. I mean, it's classic Trek, and it's funny because just casually I've been rewatching all of The Next Generation, love it, and not to spoil anything, but they have some episodes like this where you're just like, really? This seems like such a simple kind of, but obviously you have to have some bottled episodes like this. You know, these old tropey kind of things that just work. You know, they could do a little more on TNG because of effects and whatnot, but I still think it works, even in that context of a 20-year later series, and it worked here fabulously. And the way they paint this agonizing decision, you really feel for Kirk, and you feel like you've got two people who are both competing for the same reasons to go out there and do this, not just to save everybody, but to learn. And you get that feeling of exploration, which some of the great original series episodes, they do feel a little bit less like exploration and a little bit more warlike, which, I mean, we've talked about in the movies. You know, you all remember when we were just explorers, and it kind of comes back to like, this is literally what the Enterprise is out there to do, to seek out strange new life, and this is quite strange, for sure. But we get a lot of like classic Trek moments here that I'd sort of forgotten about, like the Spock all of a sudden making a face where he's like, and you know, now of course it's a meme, and you get the head nods at the end, which is by far one of my favorite GIFs to use and throw out. It's just it's such a great episode, but it's gut wrenching in a way, because you're kind of like, wow, like this would have been a great way to write off either Spock or McCoy. I mean, truly, you know, sacrificing yourself to save the ship, you know, obviously that's what they did in Star Trek II. I didn't ever feel let down by Kirk. You know, even with his little monologue, which kind of gives away, sort of tells you instead of shows you the agony he's going through, it somehow worked. And again, you remember this is the small screen. We don't have 95 minutes that a big screen could show him, sitting there with his glass of scotch, slowly swirling it, staring at the bar, and Guinan walking up. Or, of course, it'd be Guinan because it's got to be Guinan. She's in all of the Star Treks, right?
Right.
But it's one of those things that it feels like it shouldn't work. It really did watching it again. I'm just like, wow, it shouldn't be compelling, especially the umpteenth time I've seen this episode. It still feels pretty good. In terms of being exciting and keeping you gripped. I do think picking Spock is sort of the obvious choice. So part of me is a little let down because I feel like McCoy would have been the surprise choice. And all of a sudden now you've got, Dr. McCoy out there where really everybody I think would be like, wow, I can't believe they sent McCoy. They should have sent Spock. I mean, McCoy's not going to be able to pull this off. But then if he did, I mean, what a great twist of fate that would be. But, it doesn't diminish from the episode. I think the choice was logical. Remember, Spock is Kirk's logic branch. So it really did play into that. It really, I think, solidifies this big three idea that the film's carried through with. And this is, I think, probably that pivotal moment in the original series where you finally have established everything that these three characters embody in terms of their relationship with each other.
Something just hit me as you were saying all that, because I've always thought that... Is my mic okay? Are we good? Okay. I always thought that Data was the easy way out for everything. And I always thought that Data was the Spock of TNG in a sense. So I love what you're bringing up about McCoy, because I think that would have been a great curveball that you still could have hit it out of the park with, to make that choice, which is going to lead me to the next comment. I'm going to see how you feel about this. And you two can comment on it better because you watched the entire series and I have not. This might be the thing that makes DS9 very special, because I don't think there's a super all around super person in a sense that can tackle all of the issues. Is there?
Yeah.
Because in Voyager, it's obviously 7 or 9, right? Or Tuvok. So do we really see that in DS9? Now,
Odo.
Again, I haven't seen.
Well, yeah,
this much,
Odo
so
to
me, I'm
a
like,
degree, right?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, but he can just shapeshift.
Right.
Garrick.
Yeah, I mean,
Garrick kind of has the underhanded
Cardassian,
knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So DS9 does have their own version of
but it's sort of spread around, which is, I mean, when we talk about DS9, it's going to be something to talk about because you're right. They've really taken this Paragon character and instead of having and I agree, Data is kind of the Spock of Next Gen.
Oh yeah.
And certainly 7 of 9, and to some extent Tuvok before her and Kess before him, those characters kind of all assume that role of the big money player, or perhaps one could say the Roman Reigns.
Hello.
Of the series. Woo, that's a reach. But no, I think that is probably one of the more interesting points about Deep Space Nine is they didn't have that. You sort of did, and I think in an underhanded way you really definitely did, but not in the traditional sense at all, which is cool.
So now, and this is going to be what's going to be, in my opinion, this is going to be one of the great things about when we talk about DS9, because I am now the novice, and you are obviously both well-versed captains, or maybe even admirals when it comes to DS9. So here's what I'm going to kind of say to what your comments there. It's not obvious to me that there isn't a super everyman like it is when you watch TOS and it's Spock after 2 episodes because he's got all the science knowledge and everything, and it's Data, and you just know that because he's an android. So he's got to be an all-knowing type of thing. So, and all the episodes, again, that's why I brought it up, because all the episodes of DS9 I saw, I felt like the crew had to work together to figure out a lot of these things where we could default ourselves to Spock or to Data to either take on this kind of task, figure out a solution to something. Like it kind of seemed like you could always, or maybe that was the plot escape or the plot piece you could always do to figure out the issue is to toss it to one of them in a sense, which would have made it more compelling, to your point again, if they would have had McCoy do that. So I do think that is a nice little piece of this episode. And I referenced this before. I'm going to reference it one more time. I love the episode of TNG where Troy is trying to get, to level up, and she's got to make that decision about sending, I think it was Geordi, to fix the warp core or something. And I believe it was Riker who was telling her, like, those are the kind of decisions you have to make, right? Like, or maybe it's Picard. I think it was Riker. Like, if you want the responsibility, these are some of the consequences in a sense almost, and you're seeing it here with Kirk. Like, it's evident. He's got to pick between his two best friends. And that's not an easy thing to do because kind of was leading him possibly to their doom. But that's part of being a captain.
Excellent.
That's all.
Exactly. The both actors, Nimoy and Shatner, get to give tributes to the crew, and I think if you were just looking at it from 10,000 feet, you'd say, well, we only really needed one of them. But I enjoyed the both. Spock giving a shout out to his crewman, and Kirk doing so on the bridge. I might have even gotten a little lump in my throat when I considered it. So it's the kind of emotional grounding that this show now has earned in a season and a half, closing in on the climax of the second season. And it's nice to see, because even though it's not a serialized program like some of the later, Picards and Strange New Worlds and so forth, it gives us an emotional sort of anchor to latch onto. Like these aren't just actors showing up on set and doing their lines. We were invested in these characters. And so I think that moment, before all heck breaks loose and they finally get it out of reverse, I think that's important. It's also important to know that, yet again, we don't have Sulu at the helm, and he probably could have, gotten that ship right back out of the zone of darkness there pretty swiftly. He's still off shooting the Green Berets with John Wayne. So I hope that movie made a fortune and swept that year's Academy Awards, because he's certainly missing out on some quality Star Trek time. And nobody seems to notice, hey, anybody seen Sulu? It's just, we'll just put another faceless guy in next to Chekhov and go with that there. So those were my things there. I always like to give the nod to the shuttlecraft. Galileo! It's always nice to see that there. And even if it's revised special effects, still looks pretty good for 1968. So, and I would assume that Lord Uther would have caught on, I think it was Captain Kirk. I wrote down the note. I assume this is his dialogue. We're dying. We're all dying. I'm assuming that was a Shatnerism, because I didn't write who attributed it to, but I don't think anyone could deliver that line with as much panache as that Canadian heartthrob, Bill. So those were kind of the thoughts there overall. And like I say, when Joseph Pevney was not working at his A game, then we had Cat's Paw, and when he was, we had Journey to Babel. Babel. We had The Trouble with Tribbles. We had Wolf in the Fold. We had The Deadly Years. We had The City on the Edge of Forever. A Taste of Armageddon. So many of the episodes that you fondly remember or are seeing for the first time came under his stewardship. And like I say, without him and Mark Daniels, there's no telling if the show would still be able to reach out and grab us and excite our imaginations and our passion for exploration and discovery, 60 years down the road. So again, I'm dedicating this to Mr. Pevney, and he probably just showed up with a cigar and said, all right, what are we shooting today? I can imagine. But in the same breath, he's left a lasting impression, and he deserves special mention amongst all the talented cast and crew that made the original series so beloved.
Absolutely. And I think we've gushed about this episode quite a bit, but our Warp Core ratings may not be what you may anticipate, fans. All 1,000+ of you out there here pending rebrand watching the Warp Core podcast, I'm sure you're dying to know. The Immunity Syndrome, Lord Uther, how many Warp Cores?
Though I enjoyed this episode, I believe we kind of said in one of our previous pods that it's going to be a little wavy as the season kind of moves along, and reserving those 6 and 7s are probably only going to be for the best of the best episodes. So with that long introduction to my rating, I'm going to give it. I think I'm going to go 4.5. Good episode. Good episode. I'm going 4.5. Good episode. I'm going to leave it at that. Fert Derby.
I think I'm just half a notch ahead of you, Lord Uther. I think it's 5, but I think that extra half is in appreciation of all of Pevney's contributions over the show. So yeah, maybe I'm a little biased. It's not the standalone Trek, like you say, that you might say, hey, let's start with the Immunity Syndrome. But in the same breath, it's not the Apple or Who Mourns for Adonis, which had their shortcomings, so to speak. So I think, like you say, it's decent Trek, and I'm going to give it just a little bit more spit and polish because, like I say, this is a guy who showed up for weeks on cardboard sets and, effects that were not there on the set, and Gorn, guys in green lizard suits running around Vasquez Rocks. And he made the best of the hand he was dealt. And he's a pretty shrewd card player, although I think in some cases he probably made up the rules like Kirk did in A Piece of the Action. But I'm going to go with a solid 5 right there. 5 stars out of 7. Warp Course.
And I am not immune from frogs in my throat. I will say I love this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. The whole title throws me off. The Immunity Syndrome really doesn't have anything to do with anything in this episode, and that kind of gives me a little bit of pause at giving it a 6, but I do feel it's a solid 5.5. It's not a perfect episode. It's no 7. I would give it a 6, but the title doesn't tell me anything, and I feel like that's such a powerful title to give an episode. And if I was watching this for the first time and I saw that title, I'd be like, oh, this is going to be one of those ones where the whole Enterprise gets infected with something. And
basically, they were sleeping.
It doesn't quite. Yeah, it really didn't. It really didn't give me much. Like the energy drain thing was cool, but give me something different. Give me a different type.
Yeah, I think you have to be a Trek, and maybe this is why I gave it the 4.5. I think you have to be a Trek fan to appreciate the episode. It's not one that completely grabs you or can completely hold on its own. You've got to have some of that background knowledge, I think, to appreciate it. So I think that's kind of where we're all at with this one.
Yep, agreed. And my 5.5 is entirely because I'm such a steeped Trekkie. I will admit there's bias here, but I do think in terms of painting the relationships of these characters, it's foundational for that purpose. It is not something where I would go, oh, you got to watch the Immunity Syndrome. If you had watched a good chunk of TOS, a good chunk of TNG, a good chunk of other Star Trek, I'd say, if you haven't seen the Immunity Syndrome, it's a pretty darn good episode. Oh, okay. And that's probably about right. It's pretty darn good. It's not great. It's not must-see TV, if we want to reference our, 90s era NBC. But it's still really good. I think, fans out there, if you haven't seen it and you're watching this episode of the Warp Core podcast, go out and check out the Immunity Syndrome, but make sure you loop around through some other Trek first to really, truly appreciate it. And if you need suggestions, check out our archives by hitting subscribe, going to that Warp Core podcast playlist, and just shuffle it. Just shuffle it until you get to something truly great, like Who Mourns for Adonis?
Shuffle and share, everybody. Shuffle and share.
And, as always, Warp Core podcast fans, pending rebrand fans, and to all of you in galaxies far, far away, live long and prosper.